So imagine for a second, two guys facing down the exact same historical apocalypse.
Right. The end of the world as they knew it.
Exactly. And the first guy is this wealthy, aristocratic heir. I mean, he literally sets things on fire for fun as a kid.
Yeah.
He gets expelled from Oxford for mailing atheist pamphlets to bishops, and he genuinely believes he can just rewrite the world order from a villa in Italy.
He was basically a literal and philosophical firebrand.
Yeah, that's the perfect word for him. But then you have the other guy, and he is an orphaned teenager. He's working as a surgeon's apprentice in this gritty, terrifying 19th century London hospital.
Which is just a horrific setting.
Oh, it's a nightmare. He's physically holding down screaming patients because anesthesia doesn't even exist yet. He's up to his elbows in blood and trauma every single day. And on top of that, he's racing against a terminal illness that is rapidly destroying his own lungs.
So you have these two completely opposite lives, right? Separated by this massive chasm of class, privilege, and just sheer physical reality.
But somehow, they are staring into the exact same abyss. And today, we are doing a deep dive into how these two incredibly contrasting lives birth the exact same radical idea, which is that poetry isn't, an escape from a burning world, but the ultimate weapon against it.
So if you're joining us today, you are probably trying to navigate this massive stack of literature, history, and philosophy from the British Romantic period.
Yeah, the big ones. We are focusing squarely on Percy Bysshe Shelley and John Keats, and specifically we are going to master their epic, unfinished masterworks, The Triumph of Life and Hyperion.
And we really do have a formidable stack of sources guiding our conversation today. We're weaving together some very detailed academic texts covering the biographies of Shelley and Keats.
Plus the section-by-section breakdowns of those epic fragments.
Right, along with the grim political reality of the Romantic Age. And we're even pulling in W.B. Yeats's specific philosophical critique of Shelley's underlying symbolism.
So our mission for this deep dive is clear. By the time we wrap up, you're going to understand the absolute DNA of these poets so thoroughly, you could honestly walk into a master's level literature exam and completely own the room.
We are going to unpack what they wrote, sure, but more importantly, the mechanics of why they wrote it, how their specific messy life circumstances literally forged their art.
But before we can just drop into the minds of Shelley or Keats, we kind of have to establish a baseline. We need to understand the world they were trying so desperately to tear down.
Yeah, you really cannot grasp the magnitude of the Romantic Rebellion without understanding the establishment they were rebelling against.
Which was the Augustan Age, right?
Exactly. The Augustan Age, or the Neoclassical period. This was the domain of writers like John Dryden and Alexander Pope.
Whenever I try to visualize the Augustan era, I always picture this highly manicured, perfectly geometric, 18th century French formal garden.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. Like every hedge is clipped into a perfect cube. Nature is just completely bent to the will of human intellect and design. And in literature, that manifested in these incredibly strict forms.
Like the heroic couplet.
Exactly. Two rhyming lines of iambic pentameter that essentially lock a thought into this neat, tidy, perfectly balanced little box.
And that aesthetic of the manicured garden, it's deeply rooted in the philosophy of the Enlightenment. The Augustans valued reason, balance, order, and objective truth.
It was very public-facing poetry, wasn't it?
Entirely. It was written for the city, for polite society. It tackled societal themes and the behavior of civilized humanity. The underlying assumption was basically that humans are rational creatures who can and absolutely should impose order on a chaotic universe.
So when we talk about the transition into the Romantic period, it wasn't just like a slight change in reading tastes.
No, it was a total paradigm shift.
It's like taking that perfectly manicured city park and suddenly dropping the observer into the middle of a wild, freezing, unpredictable ocean in the dead of night.
That is exactly what it felt like. The Romantics completely abandoned the city as the center of the universe. They shifted all their focus to the remote. Soaring mountain peaks, untamed oceans, dark forests.
They went completely off the grid.
Right. They moved away from public commentary and plunged straight inward into the deeply personal, subjective experience. And most radically, they rejected that cold, calculating reason of the Enlightenment.
They treated it for emotion.
Intense emotion, intuition, the irrational. They even elevated the supernatural as a higher form of truth.
But I always struggle with the actual why of it all. Like whole societies don't just wake up on a random Tuesday and collectively decide, you know what, we hate geometric gardens and we suddenly love gloomy thunderstorms.
Right, there's always a trigger.
Exactly.
hmm
So what is the mechanism that triggers such a violent aesthetic shift?
Well, the sources point to a series of massive traumatic political earthquakes. You start with the long, increasingly unstable reign of King George III in Britain,
And then the American Revolution in 1776.
which proved to the world that a massive, entrenched empire could actually be defeated by an idea. But the true catalyst, I mean the absolute explosion that birthed Romanticism, was the French Revolution.
Which is wild because it started out as this incredibly intoxicating utopian dream. I mean, the older generation of romantic poets, guys like William Wordsworth, they were actually there in the beginning.
And Wordsworth famously captured that initial euphoria. He wrote that line, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven."
Yeah, in those early days, it felt like the dawn of a completely new human epic. The old, corrupt monarchies were falling. Reason and brotherhood were finally going to triumph.
But our historical sources remind us how that story actually unfolds. That utopian dream rapidly descended into the reign of terror.
The guillotine basically became the mascot of the new republic.
Exactly. The streets of Paris ran with blood, and the ideals of liberty morphed into extreme paranoia and mass execution.
And the ripple effect of that terror hitting British shores is really what creates the crucible for Shelley and Keats.
Yeah.
Because the British government is sitting there completely terrified that this violent revolution is going to cross the English Channel.
So they go into full panic mode. They instituted a severe, oppressive crackdown across the country. The government actually suspended habeas corpus, meaning they could just arrest and hold people indefinitely without a trial.
Which is terrifying. And they passed the gagging acts too, right?
Right, which severely restricted public gatherings and the press. Spies were literally everywhere. Anyone speaking out for reform or voting rights or even just for the working class was branded a Jacobin and a traitor.
You risked imprisonment or being shipped off to a penal colony in Australia. It was just this atmosphere of suffocating political paranoia.
And that paranoia is the crucial context for our poets.
Okay, but here is where the behavior of the Romantics seems incredibly counterintuitive to me. The government is cracking down, the world is essentially on fire with war and repression, and in the middle of this, poets like Keats and Shelley are writing odes to nightingales and the west wind and ancient Greek urns.
I see where you're going with this.
Right. Because if I'm looking at this from a distance, that just looks like the ultimate escapism. It looks like they are running into the woods to hide from the secret police.
And that is actually the most common critique leveled against them. But the sources we're using vehemently argue against that interpretation. It wasn't escapism at all. It was a deeply subversive pivot.
Subversive how?
Well, the texts outline a concept where Romanticism, by seemingly detaching us from the immediate, messy political chaos, actually restores us to reality at a higher point.
Okay, but how does writing about a bird or a random beggar accomplish that, practically speaking?
Think about the machine they were fighting against. British society was rapidly industrializing. It was obsessed with greed, governed by corrupt urban institutions, and enforced by this oppressive state power.
So the state just viewed individuals as cogs in a machine.
Exactly, a military or economic machine. So by turning their poetic focus to a solitary child or a beggar on the street or even a bird singing in a forest, the Romantics were committing a radical political act.
Because it forces the reader to acknowledge the inherent worth of something the state considers completely worthless.
Precisely. It reasserts the absolute autonomy and the profound, almost divine worth of the individual human spirit. By focusing on nature and raw emotion, they were searching for these fundamental, eternal truths that predated the corrupt, man-made institutions of their time.
So they weren't hiding from politics. They were trying to completely redefine what it meant to be a human being within any political system.
Exactly. Now, to understand how this political radicalism actually manifested in a real human life, we have to turn to Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Because his biography is just as chaotic as the era itself. I mean, he was born in 1792 into a highly privileged, wealthy, aristocratic family in Sussex. He is literally in line to inherit a baronetcy. He has every single societal advantage you could possibly have.
But from childhood, he operates on a completely different frequency. The biographical texts describe a mind that was relentlessly curious and deeply, deeply eccentric.
Eccentric is putting it mildly.
Well, he was obsessed with the cutting-edge sciences of his day, particularly chemistry and galvanism. which is the study of electricity and its effects on biology.
But he wasn't just quietly reading about it in a library. The sources detail how he would literally dress his younger sisters up as fiends, lead them out into the dark garden at night, and just set a fire stove blazing with volatile chemicals.
He's operating like a 19th century mad scientist before he's even hit puberty.
And that extreme nonconformity made him an immediate target when he entered the rigid, aristocratic world of Eton College.
Oh, absolutely. At Eton, you survived by adhering to strict hierarchies, participating in sports, and blending in. Shelley despised all of it. He was mercilessly bullied by the other boys.
They used to mob him, didn't they?
Yes, they would mob him, driving him into these furious rages. They dubbed him Mad Shelley. But rather than breaking him into submission, this environment merely galvanized a lifelong, burning hatred for all forms of institutional authority.
Which perfectly sets the stage for his time at Oxford University.
Yeah.
I mean, he arrives already primed for a massive rebellion. And he doesn't just quietly rebel in his dorm room.
No, he goes big.
He teams up with his friend Thomas Jefferson Hogg, and they co-author this philosophical pamphlet titled The Necessity of Atheism.
And we really must pause to understand the sheer audacity of this act. Oxford in the early 19th century was fundamentally a religious institution. It was responsible for training the clergy of the Church of England.
So suggesting that atheism was not only possible but logically necessary was deeply offensive to them.
But Shelley and Hogg didn't just publish it and hide it. They actively mailed it to the bishops and the heads of the Oxford colleges.
Which is just wild. It's the equivalent of walking into the Pentagon and handing out blueprints for dismantling the military. It's a deliberate provocation.
Completely deliberate. And when he was called before the university authorities to answer for the pamphlet, Shelley refused to confirm or deny his authorship. The records describe him acting contumaciously.
Meaning with stubborn, arrogant defiance.
Right. So he was immediately expelled. And this singular act completely detonated his relationship with his conservative father, effectively cutting him off from his family and his expected inheritance.
So now he's an exiled aristocratic teenager living in London, totally steeped in radical philosophy. And this leads directly to the first of several disastrous personal decisions, which is his first marriage to Harriet Westbrook.
To understand this marriage, the sources say we have to introduce a crucial philosophical framework that basically dictated Shelley's life, and that is Godwinian anarchism.
Right, from William Godwin.
Yes, Godwin was a radical political philosopher who argued that human beings are inherently rational and good, but they are corrupted by human institutions, specifically the government, private property, and the institution of marriage.
Because Godwin viewed marriage as an oppressive property contract.
Exactly. So for Shelley, who absolutely worshipped Godwin's writings, getting married wasn't just a personal choice, it was a philosophical minefield. The sources note that his relationship with Harriet, who was a 16-year-old girl at the time, wasn't a grand romantic love match.
She actually wrote to Shelley claiming she was being persecuted at her school because of her association with his atheist ideas, and she was desperately unhappy at home.
For Shelley, fueled by these Godwinian ideals of dismantling oppression, this whole thing became a rescue mission. He eloped with Harriet to save her from what he perceived as tyranny.
But because he fundamentally disbelieved in the concept of marriage in the first place, the foundation was entirely unstable.
And the fallout of this is incredibly dark. Shelley's personal life just becomes this whirlwind of chaos, largely because he tries to apply abstract utopian philosophies to real, messy human beings.
Yeah, he eventually abandons Harriet to run away with Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who is, ironically, William Godwin's daughter, and who would later go on to write Frankenstein.
Leaving Harriet in a terrible situation.
Awful. She's left pregnant by another man, utterly despondent, and she tragically dies by suicide, drowning herself in the Serpentine River in London.
It is a deeply troubling chapter. Looking at the historical consensus, his actions were entirely driven by these radical philosophies, but they left a trail of immense real-world human collateral damage.
And the academic texts we are studying pose a really challenging question here. They ask, can a life be considered good in a broader humanist sense if it is so loose and destructive on a personal level?
It's tough. His views on free love, his anti-religion stance, and his virulent anti-monarchy activism were genuinely revolutionary. But his treatment of the women in his life is widely and rightfully condemned.
And we have to make sure we're looking at this raw, controversial material objectively, just as the sources present it. We aren't endorsing his life choices, but his poetry is inextricably entangled with his political and personal dogma.
We can't understand the sweeping cosmic arguments of his epics if we don't understand the deeply flawed radical life that generated them. He wasn't just sitting in a room theorizing. He was actively, exhaustingly trying to force the world to bend to his political will.
He was a relentless activist. I mean, he traveled to Ireland, which was essentially hostile territory for a British aristocrat, to actively agitate for Catholic emancipation. He was literally handing out political pamphlets on the streets of Dublin.
He also became a fervent vegetarian during this time.
I really want to pause on the vegetarianism, actually, because today, we view that primarily as a dietary or environmental choice. But for Shelley, how did not eating a steak translate to political radicalism?
For Shelley, it was deeply interconnected. He believed that human tyranny, violence, and war were rooted in the violence humans inflicted upon animals. He argued that a diet of blood literally corrupted the human physical and moral constitution. Therefore, refusing to eat meat was a fundamental step toward eradicating the bloodlust that fueled the oppressive British Empire.
So literally every aspect of his life was weaponized for radical change. And this is the period where he writes Queen Mab, right? A fiercely anti-establishment, anti-religious poem that later became known as the Chartists' Bible.
Let's clarify that term because it really shows his long-term impact. The Chartists were a massive working-class movement later in the 19th century demanding political rights and suffrage.
And they literally carried Shelley's poem in their pockets like a sacred text because it articulated their oppression so perfectly.
But despite writing the textbook on working-class revolution, there is this incredible anecdote in the sources that exposes the fatal flaw in Shelley's worldview.
Oh, the encounter in Wales. This is such a striking moment. So Shelley's in Wales, and he encounters a local beggar. Shelley is overflowing with these high-minded Godwinian ideals about equality and the brotherhood of man, so he strikes up a conversation with him.
And the beggar listens to him.
He listens. He looks at Shelley's pristine aristocratic clothing. He looks at the sprawling house Shelley is renting, and he says something to the effect of, "I see by your dress that you are a rich man. You appear well-intentioned, but I have no security of it while you live in such a house and wear such clothes. It would be charity to quit me."
It is a devastating, clarifying moment. The beggar just slices right through all the philosophical rhetoric. He exposes the inherent hypocrisy of an aristocrat preaching equality while actively benefiting from the economic disparity that created the beggar in the first place.
It's the ultimate champagne socialist dilemma, hitting him square in the jaw. And the source notes that this encounter left a profound, lasting mark on Shelley.
It forced him to grapple with the brutal reality that high-minded philosophy doesn't feed a starving man, and that he could never truly shed the privilege he was born into.
And this realization, combined with mounting financial ruin, intense societal outrage over his lifestyle, and the death of Harriet and his own rapidly failing health, ultimately drives Shelley and Mary into permanent exile in Italy.
Where they form the peasant circle, surrounded by other literary exiles like Lord Byron. But the tragedy doesn't stop. They lose multiple young children to illness in Italy. The idealism is just being constantly ground down by the brutality of physical existence.
Which brings us to the summer of 1822. Shelley is out sailing his custom-built boat, the Ariel, in the Gulf of Spezia off the Italian coast. A sudden violent squall hits the bay. The boat founders and sinks, and Shelley drowns at the age of 29.
The details of his death are so cinematic it almost feels scripted. When his body washed ashore days later, they identified him by what was in his pockets. A volume of the ancient Greek playwright Aeschylus in one pocket, and a volume of John Keats' poems in the other.
With the page folded back, as if he had just been reading it when the storm hit.
It is a tragic, abrupt end. But the crucial point for our analysis is that all of this, the revolutionary zeal, the haunting guilt over Harriet, the loss of his children, the realization of his own hypocrisy, all of this psychic weight poured into the very last document he was writing before he boarded that boat.
His unfinished masterpiece, The Triumph of Life. Let's break down the architecture of this poem, because if you're taking an exam on romanticism, this text is the absolute pinnacle.
The texts note that The Triumph of Life is widely considered his finest work, specifically because it achieves a cold, terrifying detachment that his earlier, more aggressive political poems lacked.
Let's start with the literal form. It's written in terza rima. What are the mechanics of that form, and what is Shelley signaling to us by using it?
Terza rima is an intricate, interlocking three-line rhyme scheme that goes ABA, then BCB, then CDC, creating this continuous forward-pulling momentum.
It never really lets you rest.
Exactly. And the critical piece of context here is that this is the exact verse form invented by Dante Alighieri for the Divine Comedy. So by choosing terza rima, Shelley is sending a massive signal to the reader. He's not writing a simple political complaint. He is writing a sweeping, visionary epic about the ultimate destiny of the human soul, charting a journey through hell just as Dante did.
And the opening sequence perfectly sets up this Dantean vision. The narrator of the poem has stayed awake all night, tossing and turning. As the sun rises, he falls into a waking trance.
He has an intense prophetic vision.
Right, he sees a massive, terrifying public procession. It's a frantic crowd of millions of people swirling and rushing aimlessly, described as being blown around like autumn leaves in a violent storm. And they're all chasing this blinding light.
The light is emanating from the chariot of life. And Shelley's imagery here is deliberately paradoxical and unsettling. The chariot is dazzling, brighter than the sun, yet it casts a chilling, cold shadow.
What does the chariot represent?
It represents the relentless, unstoppable progression of chronological time and earthly existence.
And the driver of this chariot is deeply ominous. It's a four-faced figure with its eyes banded, completely blindfolded. It's a representation of Janus, the Roman god of beginnings and endings.
The blindfolded driver signifies that life, in the earthly material sense, has no moral direction. It is a blind, mechanical force that simply rolls over everything in its path, regardless of human intention or virtue.
The analogy that jumps out to me is like a surreal, nightmarish treadmill.
A treadmill, exactly.
We have all these people running blindly, fueled by their own ambitions, desperate to keep up with the blinding light of the chariot. But the motor of the treadmill is completely blind. And the faster you run to grab the prize, whether it's power, love, or fame, the faster the treadmill throws you off the back and just crushes you.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. And the narrator is watching this horrific scene, completely overwhelmed, and he cries out, "What is life?" And someone actually answers him.
A guide appears. Just as the Roman poet Virgil appeared to guide Dante through the Inferno, Shelley's narrator is met by a guide. But it isn't an ancient poet. It is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the most prominent philosophers of the 18th century Enlightenment.
But Rousseau is in horrific shape. The narrator doesn't even recognize him as a human at first. He describes Rousseau as looking like an old, distorted root growing out of the side of a hill, just battered and destroyed.
Why does Shelley choose Rousseau, of all people? And why is he reduced to a gnarled piece of wood?
The choice of Rousseau is brilliant. Rousseau's philosophy, particularly his idea that man is born free but is everywhere in chains, and his emphasis on innate human goodness, was the intellectual bedrock for both the French Revolution and the Romantic movement itself.
So Rousseau basically represents the absolute peak of human intellect and idealism.
Exactly. So if anyone could figure out how to beat the chariot, it should be him. But Rousseau looks like a distorted root because he, too, has been conquered and ruined by life.
He feels just like everyone else.
He explains to the narrator that despite his brilliant mind, he was ultimately corrupted by his own passions, his ego, and his failure to align his high-minded ideals with his actual physical life. He succumbed to the very earthly chains he wrote about. And because he is ruined, he is uniquely qualified to explain the procession to the narrator.
Rousseau points to the people chained to the chariot, the captives being dragged along. And this isn't just a crowd of anonymous commoners. He points out Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great, Francis Bacon, the Emperor Constantine.
These are the titans of human history, the greatest philosophers, conquerors, and architects of civilization, and every single one of them is chained to the chariot.
Rousseau explains the mechanics of their captivity, right? They are captives because they sought worldly power. The emperors sought military conquest. The philosophers sought intellectual dominance and fame.
Because they invested their energy into trying to control the material world eventually crushed them. Their intellect couldn't save them from the corrupting decay of earthly existence.
But the sources make a massive point to highlight an exception here, which is a major key for understanding Shelley's ultimate philosophy. There is a specific group missing from the chains, known as the sacred few.
Yes, the narrator looks closely at the captives and realizes that Socrates and Jesus Christ are absent.
Why them? If Plato and Aristotle got chained, how did Socrates escape?
According to Shelley's vision, Socrates and Jesus avoided the chains because they categorically refused to compromise with earthly power. They didn't build empires, they didn't write books to secure intellectual legacy, and they didn't seek wealth.
They just focused on the internal.
They maintained an absolute unyielding commitment to their inner spiritual integrity, even when it meant accepting death. Because they never valued the prizes of the material world, the chariot of life had no leverage over them. They could not be conquered.
Okay, so that establishes the philosophy. But
Yeah.
then Rousseau tells his own backstory, which brings us to the allegory of the cup. He explains exactly how he went from being a visionary thinker to a gnarled root dragged by a blindfolded driver.
He says that in his youth, he encountered a shape-all-light that offered him a crystal cup.
This shape all light is one of the most debated symbols in the poem, isn't it?
It is. It is generally interpreted as representing pure divine inspiration, human imagination, or perhaps the concept of nepenthe.
What are the mechanics of Nepenthe?
In ancient Greek literature, nepenthe is a mythical potion or drug that completely banishes grief and sorrow from the mind, bringing absolute forgetfulness. Rousseau is offered this cup of light. He drinks from it, desiring that pure enlightenment, hoping to transcend the suffering of the world.
Why, it's a trap.
It is the ultimate tragedy. The moment Rousseau drinks the glowing liquid, he says his brain is saddled with calm. But the cost of that calm is his divine memory.
He loses himself.
He forgets his origins. He forgets the eternal truths. The beautiful, blinding vision of the shape of light suddenly fades away, replaced instantly by the harsh, cold, blinding glare of the chariot's procession. By reaching for the divine escape, he is thrust directly into the brutal reality of earthly life. He becomes a captive.
It's like reaching for a mirage of water in the desert, and the second you touch it, you realize it's a mechanism that locks a collar around your neck. The act of grasping for pure inspiration is the very thing that pulls you into the messy, corrupting compromise of existing in the physical world.
Precisely. And this is where the academic texts introduce the critique by the great 20th century poet W.B. Yeats. Yeats wrote an essay called The Philosophy of Shelley's Poetry, and it completely reframes how we're supposed to read the triumph of life.
Right, because before Yeats, critics mostly looked at Shelley as a political parrot, just regurgitating William Godwin's anarchist tracts and slapping a rhyme scheme on them.
Yeats argued that this political reading was far too shallow. Yeats identified that Shelley wasn't just a political activist, he was fundamentally a mystic.
How did Yeats prove that?
He meticulously tracked how Shelley used a recurring system of deeply mystical symbols across his entire body of work. The dark cave, the underground river, the isolated tower, the morning star.
The source also mentions the soul being like a bee returning to its kindred star.
Yes, exactly. For Yeats, these aren't just pretty metaphors. They represent a cohesive spiritual system. So when we apply Yeats's lens to the triumph of life, it elevates the poem from a political complaint to a cosmic tragedy.
How does that shift the meaning of the chariot?
It means the poem is depicting the brutal clash between the eternal, mystical realm represented by the star, the pure imagination, the shape-all light, and the degrading chronological reality of earthly existence, represented by the chariot.
Wow, so it's much bigger than politics.
For Yeats, Shelley wasn't merely lamenting that kings are tyrants and politicians are corrupt. He was lamenting the foundational tragedy of the divine soul being trapped inside a physical body subject to time and decay.
So Shelley, the aristocrat in his Italian villa, reaches the conclusion that the very act of living in the material world is a tragic defeat. But now we have to dramatically shift gears. We have to look at what happens to romantic idealism when it is born not from privilege and political theory, but from actual physical working-class desperation.
Which brings us to John Keats, a man who was literally up to his elbows in the blood and suffering of the world.
The contrast is just staggering. Keats's background is the polar opposite of Shelley's. He was born in 1795, not in a Sussex mansion, but as the son of a livery stable manager in London. He was orphaned at a young age. There was no Eton College, no Oxford University.
Instead, he was pulled out of school and apprenticed to a surgeon and apothecary named Thomas Hammond.
And we really need to pause and visualize the grim mechanics of what that meant. Being a surgeon's apprentice in a London hospital, specifically Guy's Hospital in the early 1810s, was basically being a trauma doctor in a butcher shop.
It's horrific to even think about.
This is decades before the invention of anesthesia. This is before the germ theory of disease. Keats's daily life involved physically holding down terrified, screaming patients while surgeons performed amputations. He was dealing with shattered bones, festering wounds, and agonizing deaths on a daily basis.
He knew the visceral, physical reality of human suffering intimately. While Shelley was theorizing about the nature of pain from a philosophical distance, Keats had the blood on his apron.
He eventually abandoned medicine to pursue poetry full-time in 1816, but that profound, grounded empathy for physical and mental suffering became the absolute bedrock of his art.
But transitioning from the operating theater to the literary world was a brutal awakening for him. Because he didn't have a university degree and because he was associated with a radical publisher named Leigh Hunt, Keats walked directly into a buzzsaw of class prejudice.
The conservative literary establishment of the time was incredibly elitist, weren't they?
Oh, viciously so.
Yeah.
A prominent critic named John Gibson Lockhart, writing for Blackwoods magazine, launched a series of personal attacks against Keats and his circle. Lockhart actually coined an incredibly derogatory term, dismissing them as the Cockney school of poetry.
It wasn't just a critique of his rhyming technique, though. It was an attack on his right to even exist in their sphere. They essentially told him, "You are a lower-class apothecary. Go back to making pills and rolling bandages. Epic poetry belongs to gentlemen."
And it was far more dangerous than just literary snobbery. Lockhart also attacked them as the Cockney school of politics. In that era of intense government paranoia we talked about, labeling Keats and Leigh Hunt as a political faction was essentially painting a target on their backs.
So his work was seen as borderline seditious simply because of his class.
Yes. The establishment viewed Keats's work as a threat simply because a man of his lower middle-class status was daring to elevate his voice. It threatened the cultural monopoly of the aristocracy.
So he's fighting class warfare just to get his poems read. But that's not even his biggest battle. Looming over all of this is the ticking clock of tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was called, was an absolute death sentence in the 19th century. And Keats, with his medical training, understood the pathology of the disease better than anyone.
He saw it firsthand with his family.
He nursed his younger brother Tom through the final agonizing stages of TB, watching him slowly suffocate to death in 1818.
And shortly after Tom dies, Keats coughs up a single drop of arterial blood. With his medical background, he looks at the bright red color of the blood on his handkerchief and allegedly says, "I know the color of that blood. It is my death warrant."
He knew exactly how much time he had left, and he knew exactly how horrific the end would be. This brutal realization triggers what is known as his Annus Mirabilis, his year of miracles in 1819.
Knowing he was dying, Keats produced an astonishing volume of masterpiece poetry, including his great odes, in a frantic, feverish race against his own decaying lungs.
This brings up a critical question regarding his artistic choices during this frantic period. If Keats is hanging out with radicals like Leigh Hunt, and he is facing all this oppression from the aristocratic critics, why didn't he write fiery political pamphlets like Shelley?
Right. Why, when he only has months to live, is he writing about ancient Greek gods and urns?
It's a fundamental question. First, we must look at the immediate political mechanics of 1819. This was the year of the Peterloo Massacre. In August, tens of thousands of working-class people gathered peacefully in Manchester to demand parliamentary reform and voting rights.
And the local magistrates panicked?
They sent armed cavalry charging into the unarmed crowd with sabers drawn, killing over a dozen and injuring hundreds.
A completely traumatic national event.
And in the aftermath, the government didn't punish the cavalry. They punished the people. They passed the 6 Acts, which essentially made any political meeting or critical publication an act of treason.
So for someone of Keats's vulnerable class, without the shield of Shelley's aristocratic wealth, writing open political sedition was a fast track to prison, transportation, or the gallows.
So it was a matter of sheer survival, but it also goes deeper into his philosophy of what poetry is actually for. Keats fundamentally rejected the idea that poetry should be reduced to mere political propaganda. He wrote in a letter that the true primary subject of poetry must be the agonies, the strife of human hearts. He didn't want to write about fleeting political arguments. He wanted to write about the enduring reality of human suffering.
So how does he do that without getting arrested?
He uses ancient Greek mythology. Keats spent hours staring at the Elgin marbles, the ancient Greek sculptures recently installed in the British Museum. He realized that pagan mythology offered a massive, culturally safe allegorical canvas.
Oh, that makes sense.
By writing about ancient Titans and Olympians, he could deeply explore the mechanics of revolution, the violent transfer of power, and profound human grief, all while flying completely under the radar of the government censors.
Which brings us to the centerpiece of our Keats analysis. His unfinished epic, Hyperion. For anyone prepping for an exam, let's establish the structural baseline of this text.
Hyperion is written in blank verse, which is unrhymed iambic pentameter. This is a deliberate, highly ambitious choice because it is the exact meter John Milton used for Paradise Lost.
So he's aiming high.
Keats is trying to write the ultimate English epic of his generation, but he is stripping away Milton's rigid Christian theology and replacing it with pagan mythology to explore raw human dynamics.
The poem begins in medias where he's right in the middle of the action. The older generation of gods, the massive earthbound titans, have just been violently overthrown by their own children, the new, beautiful generation of Olympians.
And we open on the defeated Titan king, Saturn, sitting in a dark, silent valley in absolute stunned despair.
This leads into Book 2, which is the Titan Conference.
Yeah.
The fallen gods gather to debate what has happened to them and what they should do next. This section is an absolute goldmine for analysis because Keats meticulously assigns a specific political and philosophical worldview to each Titan.
Let's break down these distinct voices. We start with Saturn, the deposed king.
What does he represent?
Saturn represents the ancient regime, the old, absolute, divine right monarchies of Europe before the French Revolution. His psychological state is paralysis. He is isolated, heavily patriarchal, and completely unable to comprehend a universe where his word is not absolute law.
He just keeps asking, how did I fall?
Because his brain literally lacks the capacity to understand change. He's stuck in an endless loop of denial.
Then you have Enceladus, who is the loudest and angriest voice in the room.
Enceladus is the archetype of the reactionary warmonger. He represents the stubborn, violent factions of the aristocracy who refuse to accept that the world has evolved. His only solution is brute force.
He just wants to fight.
He wants to tear up the mountains and go to war to forcefully drag the universe back into the past. Notably, during the council, he contemptuously shouts down the voices of the female deities, showing his rigid adherence to the old, aggressive hierarchies.
Contrast that boiling rage with Oceanus, the god of the sea. He brings a completely different temperature to the debate.
Oceanus is the voice of the Enlightenment, representing objective reason and natural law. He stands up and delivers a harsh truth to the angry Titans. He tells them they weren't defeated by a trick or a betrayal. They were defeated by the inevitable, mechanical march of evolutionary progress.
He has that famous line, "We fall by course of nature's law."
Exactly. Oceanus argues that the Olympians rule now because they are a more advanced, more beautiful iteration of existence. Just as the Titans replaced the chaotic forces of darkness, the Olympians must replace the Titans. Change is the only constant in the universe, and Oceanus argues that true wisdom lies in accepting this evolution with stoic grace, rather than fighting it.
But while Oceanus has the most logical argument, the most fascinating voice to me is Clymene. She is just a minor, relatively powerless sea nymph, but she is the only one in the room who actually feels the reality of the situation.
Clymene is a crucial pivot point in the poem. While the giant male Titans are loudly debating laws, power, and war, Clymene speaks about a deeply intuitive emotional experience.
What does she tell them?
She tells them that she was sitting by the shore trying to play a sad, comforting song on a shell when she suddenly heard a new music drifting across the water. It was the music of Apollo, the young Olympian god of poetry.
And her reaction to this music is incredibly complex.
Yes, she describes it as a blissful golden melody that rushed into her, bringing her both intense, overwhelming joy and a profound, agonizing sorrow simultaneously. The sheer beauty of the new world broke her heart.
So she didn't reason it out like Oceanus.
She intuitively grasped the supreme power of the new Olympian order through feeling.
She is the bridge that takes us into Book 3, which introduces the hero of the new order, the rise of Apollo.
Apollo is the god of poetry, light, and healing. But Keats makes a radical choice here. Apollo doesn't seize the throne by lifting weights, forging weapons, or fighting a bloody war like Enceladus wanted.
How does he gain power then?
Apollo gains his supreme divinity through a psychological process Keats calls knowledge enormous.
And the mechanism for acquiring this knowledge is entirely based on empathy, facilitated by a female deity.
Correct. Apollo is reaping on the beach, feeling a vast, unexplained sorrow. He is approached by Mnemosyne, the ancient goddess of memory. She looks deeply into his eyes, and through that silent connection, she imparts the vast, crushing knowledge of the entire universe into Apollo's mind.
She gives him the history of creation, but more importantly, she gives him the agonizing knowledge of all human sorrow, sickness, and death.
And the physical toll of absorbing that much empathy is violent. It is agonizing. The sheer weight of understanding all the suffering in the world causes Apollo to undergo a physical and psychological convulsion. He screams, feeling as though he is being destroyed.
But he's not being destroyed, is he?
No, he is undergoing a metamorphosis. Keats writes that Apollo is dying into life. By absorbing the ultimate pain of existence, he transcends his mortal ignorance and becomes a true, fully realized god. He conquers through empathy, not force.
It's an incredibly potent image, especially considering Keats's background in the hospital ward. Now, our sources point out that if you are analyzing Hyperion for a thesis or an exam, there are two primary lenses to apply here: the political allegory and the aesthetic allegory. Let's trace the political argument first.
Politically, Hyperion is a subtle but devastating critique of the conservative British establishment. The Titans are the ancient regime, the tyrannical kings clinging to power. The Olympians are the progressive, post-revolutionary world. Keats actively subverts the traditional power dynamics of his era by placing marginalized figures as the ultimate bearers of truth.
Right, because Enceladus, the big macho warrior, is totally wrong and just ignores the women.
Exactly. Keats makes the female deities Mnemosyne with her memory and the minor nymph Clymene with her intuition, the sources of supreme wisdom. And Apollo, a late-stage god who embraces sorrow and vulnerability rather than brute military strength, becomes the ultimate ruler. It is a radical reimagining of what legitimate power looks like.
It's a complete rejection of the Peterloo cavalry charge. He's saying real power absorbs pain. It doesn't inflict it. So that is the political angle. What about the aesthetic interpretation?
The aesthetic interpretation revolves around what is arguably Keats's most famous philosophical contribution, the concept of negative capability.
I always struggle with this term because it sounds like an insult, like you lack a skill. Explain the actual mechanics of negative capability.
Keats defined this concept in Letter to his brothers. He described negative capability as the state in which a person, specifically a great poet, is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason.
How does that actually work in practice? Is he saying a poet should just be a passive, ignorant sponge?
Not at all. Think of it like a brilliant scientist observing a highly volatile, completely unknown chemical reaction. A scientist with irritable reaching would immediately panic, try to cap the beaker, force a label on it, and fit it into an existing textbook, thereby destroying the natural process.
They need an immediate answer.
But a scientist with negative capability would sit back and simply observe the reaction in all its mystery, allowing it to unfold, holding the tension of not knowing the outcome. It is the psychological strength to hold two opposing thoughts or chaotic emotions in your mind without going crazy and demanding a neat black and white answer.
So how does negative capability act as the key to understanding who wins and who loses in Hyperion?
The Titans lose because they completely lack negative capability. Saturn and Enceladus cannot handle the uncertainty of their defeat. They frantically demand facts, reasons, and a violent return to the old, comfortable order. Their minds shatter because they cannot adapt to mystery.
And Apollo.
Apollo succeeds entirely because he embodies negative capability. When a Mnemosyne pours the agonizing mysteries of the universe into his mind, he doesn't try to rationalize it, compartmentalize it, or fight it. He allows the mystery and the suffering to completely wash over him.
He just absorbs it.
He absorbs it intuitively, like a true poet. He holds the agony of the world in his mind without reaching for a neat philosophical excuse. And that is what triggers his apotheosis into a god.
So Hyperion is fundamentally a poem about what it takes to be a true artist in a world full of pain. It's a masterpiece. But here is the craziest part of the story. Keats writes 2.5 books of this incredible epic. He hits the climax of Apollo's transformation, and then he just stops.
Yeah.
He literally abandons the poem. Why on earth would he walk away from it?
Because Keats possessed an incredibly rigorous artistic conscience. As he was writing, he realized the poem was failing his own standards. He felt it was heavily contaminated by Miltonic inversions, meaning the sentence structures were artificially flipped to sound like ancient grand poetry.
Yeah.
He wrote that it had a false beauty.
He felt like he was putting on a John Milton costume instead of speaking with his own voice.
Exactly. He realized he was writing a pastiche of an epic rather than discovering his own authentic, organic language. So in an act of staggering artistic bravery, especially for a man who knows he is dying, he abandons it.
But he doesn't throw the core ideas away. He completely dismantles the machinery of the poem and rewrites it as The Fall of Hyperion. How does the architecture of this second version shift the meaning?
The structural shift is drastic and deeply significant. He abandons the objective third-person, booming, epic voice. Instead, he casts the entire story as a deeply personal, highly subjective, first-person dream vision.
So we aren't just watching gods on a stage anymore.
No. In The Fall of Hyperion, before the narrator is even allowed to see the vision of the fallen titans, the poet himself must undergo a brutal test. In the dream, the poet enters an ancient, decaying sanctuary and is confronted by a terrifying veiled goddess named Moneta.
Moneta replaces Minusin from the first version.
Yes, and Moneta is not a gentle teacher. She challenges the poet's very right to exist. She demands to know the difference between a true poet and a mere dreamer. A dreamer, she argues, just spins pretty fantasies to escape reality. She tells him that true poets are those to whom the miseries of the world are misery and will not let them rest.
It makes the stakes incredibly personal. In the first Hyperion, Keats was writing an allegory about an ancient god absorbing pain. In The Fall of Hyperion, Keats is putting himself on trial. He is wrestling with his own guilt, asking, how can I justify sitting in a room writing poetry while the working class is being slaughtered at Peterloo and my brother is dead from tuberculosis?
It is the ultimate confrontation of the artist's utility in a broken world. Moneta forces the poet to literally climb the steps to her altar, an act that causes an agonizing, freezing numbness in his limbs, simulating the very death he was facing from tuberculosis. He must prove he can shoulder the actual physical burden of human suffering before he earns the right to witness the tragedy of the gods.
It also represents a massive shift in how he viewed his own legacy. Right?
Absolutely. When he started the first Hyperion, he was ambitious. He was trying to write a flawless epic to secure his fame, to join the ranks of the mighty dead. By the time he writes The Fall of Hyperion, he knows he is out of time. He accepts that he has zero control over his posthumous fame or what the critics like Lockhart will say about him.
He lets go of the ego.
He embraces his own subjective, flawed, authentic voice, recognizing that the process of facing the pain is more important than achieving a perfect, polished product.
But this brings up the most haunting parallel of our entire discussion. He abandons The Fall of Hyperion, too. Both Shelley's The Triumph of Life and Keats' Hyperion epics are literally unfinished texts. The sentences just break off. Now, practically, we know this is a tragic coincidence because they both died in their 20s. But is there a philosophical dimension to this? Does the fact that they are unfinished actually add to their meaning?
It is a profound academic question, and the consensus in our sources is yes. While the literal cause was early death, the romantic fragment actually evolved into a recognized, legitimate poetic form in its own right.
How does an incomplete piece of art function better than a finished one?
Consider the psychological context of the era. The previous Augustan age believed in absolute finished truths, the divine right of kings, the perfect neatness of society, a clear moral ending. But the Romantics lived through the French Revolution and the ensuing terror. They saw those absolute truths shattered overnight.
So the world was fractured.
In a rapidly changing, traumatized post-revolutionary world where everything is uncertain, presenting a neatly packaged, perfectly resolved epic with a bow on top would be a fundamental lie.
Because history doesn't have a neat moral ending. The French Revolution didn't end with everyone holding hands. It ended in endless cycles of war and compromise.
Exactly. The incomplete poem perfectly mirrors the incomplete, messy, ongoing struggle of human history. By leaving the epics unresolved, the fragment forces the reader to step into the void. It forces the reader to practice negative capability, to sit with the mystery and the lack of closure. The unwritten ending of the poem hangs there in the silence, perfectly mirroring the terrifying unwritten future of humanity itself.
That is an incredibly powerful framework. Let's synthesize everything we've uncovered today to make sure the core mechanisms are locked in for anyone studying this material. We examined two monumental figures operating in the same chaotic era.
Right, Shelley and Keats.
First, we explored Percy Bysshe Shelley, the aristocratic radical. The key mechanisms to remember for his fragment, The Triumph of Life, are his deliberate use of Dante's Terzarima to signal a cosmic epic, the chilling presence of a corrupted Rousseau as the guide, and the terrifying chariot of life that crushes those who invest their souls in worldly power. And crucially, we must view this not just as Godwinian political theory, but through W.B. Yeats's lens of mystical tragedy, the eternal soul destroyed by chronological time.
And then we turn to John Keats, the surgeon's apprentice battling the brutal realities of illness and intense class prejudice. For his fragments, the Hyperion poems recall his ambitious use of Miltonic blank verse and the philosophical clash between the rigid reactionary Titans and the progressive Olympians.
Right, the old versus the new.
Above all, grasped the absolute centrality of Apollo dying into life through the crushing weight of empathy, which perfectly illustrates Keats's ultimate philosophy of negative capability, the strength to hold the world's mystery and pain without reaching for easy answers.
We have two young men born on completely opposite ends of the societal spectrum, A fire starter in a castle and a surgeon in a slaughterhouse. Yet they both push the absolute limits of their poetic genius to wrestle with political tyranny, deeply personal tragedies, and the foundational mysteries of an era that was quite literally on fire.
They refused the temptation to retreat. They dove headfirst into the deepest agonies of their time and tried to forge a completely new mechanism for truth out of the wreckage.
Which leaves us with a lingering question to turn over in our own minds, building on the profound concept of the romantic fragment. If Keats and Shelley ultimately demonstrated that true wisdom, true knowledge enormous, can only be gained by accepting uncertainty, by realizing that history and identity are an unending, unresolved process of change, are we failing ourselves today?
That's a heavy thought.
In our modern culture, we are obsessed with finding perfect closures. We demand definitive answers, hot takes, and neatly wrapped up narratives in our politics, our relationships, and our own lives. Are we actually stunting our own intellectual and emotional growth? Are we blinding ourselves to the deeper truths of existence simply because we are too terrified to leave the story unfinished?
That is a question that requires a massive reserve of negative capability to genuinely sit with and explore.
Indeed it does. It brings us right back to the edge of the abyss where we started. Two poets, leaving us with brilliant fragments of lightning that still illuminate the dark, challenging us to look at the storm. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.